We've been going through a number of different things on the law, and actually we only have one more Bible study in this series. We have gone through an introduction to the law of God and seen how that to get an overview of the law and what that involves. We went into specifically into more details on the law and the changes that the New Testament tells us that are made specifically in two areas. We focused in on physical laws. We focused in on civil statutes. We focused in on tithing specifically. This evening we're going to focus in on ceremonial laws, and then we're going to come back next Bible study and focus in on the amplification of God's spiritual law. Because what we've seen as we've gone through this Bible study on the law is that there are many things that are involved in God's law. And that the word law refers to God's overall instruction. It instructs us in a way of life. Now, this evening, we're going into ceremonial laws. We've already talked about physical laws, and we talked about civil laws and statutes. How does the ceremonial law relate to us as Christians? Well, as we go through this evening, I think you can understand that the ceremonial law was added for a very specific reason. Now let's just turn to begin with. Let's go back to the book of Galatians, and let's understand something that the Protestants and the Catholics do not understand, and I think many of us came out of some of those backgrounds, and so we recognize that. But in the book of Galatians, chapter 3 and verse 19, Galatians 3:19, there's one part here that is sometimes quoted. It says, "Wherefore then serves the law? It was added because of transgressions. Now, till the seed should come, to whom the promise was made. It was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator." Now, at this point, of course, my old Baptist preacher used to close the Bible because that was as far as he wanted to go. And the Church of Christ and all the rest of them. What is this talking about? What law? We know that there was a law that was added because of transgressions, and whatever law that was only was until the time of Christ. It was a law that was to last until the seed should come to whom the promise was made. Now, is this law the Ten Commandments? Was the Ten Commandments added because of transgression? Well, if the Ten Commandments was added because of transgression, then what, pray tell, had been transgressed? You have to have a law to have a transgression. Can you have a law if you don't have a transgression? Years ago, back, I think it was around 1969 or 70, I was taking a trip through the Northwest, and we came into Montana. At that time, Montana did not have a speed limit. So you couldn't break the speed limit in Montana because there wasn't a speed limit. Now, you can't have a transgression unless you have a law. So here is a law that was added. But it was added because of the transgression of something else. Well, it was a law that was to last until the seed should come, until Christ would come. Let's go on then. Let's turn back to the book of Hebrews and let's see that we can make this clear. In the book of Hebrews, and we'll pick it up in chapter 9, verse 10. Well, let's pick it up in verse 8 of chapter 10. Or chapter 9, Hebrews 9, verse 8. "The Holy Spirit, this signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was yet standing, which was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices, which could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience, which stood only in meats and drinks and divers washings and carnal ordinances imposed on them until the time of Reformation. But Christ being come a high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands. Now, notice here, what was it that was to last until Christ? These things which stood only in the meats are the meat offerings, the food offerings, the drink offerings, the various washings, and the physical rituals. That's what was imposed on them till the time of Reformation. In other words, the ceremonial law. It consisted of food offerings, drink offerings. It consisted of various washings and of all sorts of physical rituals that were imposed on them until the time of Reformation. Now, Galatians 3:19 said it was imposed upon them because of transgression. Now, what was transgressed? Well, in Exodus 19, God proposed a covenant with ancient Israel. And in Exodus 20, God spoke these words, all the words of the Ten Commandments. Now, the Ten Commandments were not ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. The Ten Commandments were spoken by the mouth of God. And they were written on tables of stone with the finger of God. Yes, God does have a mouth and He does have a finger. That's what He... God... The Ten Commandments were not delivered by an angel. Very clearly. Exodus 20 verse 1. And God spoke all these words saying, I am the Lord your God. So it's very clear that this is spoken by God. Now, when we come on back in chapter 24, we find that Moses was told by God to come up unto the Lord. And we find that Moses did. And he was given directions about the tabernacle. And all these things were instructed. And in Exodus 32, you see, well, in Exodus 31:18, God gave to Moses, when He'd made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, tables of stone written with the finger of God. Now, chapter 32 says, when the people saw that Moses delayed, they wanted to make their own gods, and they got Aaron to make a golden calf. So, when Moses came down, he found that the people had transgressed the law. They had broken the covenant, which they had just made 40 days earlier. They had broken the Ten Commandments. They had made an idol and they had worshipped it. They had gotten involved in immorality. You find here they were drinking and taking their clothes off, and it was a crazy thing that Moses came down the mountain to. So what did Moses do? Moses went back up into the mountain. We find that Moses, let's just go through, I'll pick out a couple of verses. Exodus 32:25. When Moses saw that the people were naked, we find that Moses then stood in the gate of the camp, verse 26, and said, Who's on the Lord's side? And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves unto him. And Moses told them to put their sword on and to go out and slay the ringleaders of this. And they did, verse 28, according to the word of Moses. So Moses then goes back up the mountain. And so in verse 31, you see Moses returned unto the Lord. And now, on through the rest of Exodus, we find Moses is in the mountain discussing all of this with God and getting all sorts of details and instructions that and Moses comes back down. And then we come into the building of the tabernacle and the book of Leviticus, which sets apart the Levites as a priesthood. It's a function. Carrying out the ceremonies. The sacrifices are introduced in Exodus and Leviticus chapter 1. You see, the law that was added because of transgression was the ceremonial law. That was the law that was added because of transgression until the seed should come. That was the law. that was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. That was the law that stood only in the food offerings, the drink offerings, the various washings, different washings, and all of the physical rituals which were unto Christ. That was a schoolmaster, as we're told also in the book of Galatians. It was a schoolmaster. It was to teach a lesson. The ceremonial law taught lessons. And the lessons had to do with how do you gain access to God. Now, the ceremonial law did not gain access to God, but it taught a people that did not have the Spirit of God, it taught them what was involved. In the book of Hebrews, we read that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. We're also told that the blood of bulls and goats can't pay for sin. Christ offered one sacrifice for sin forever. When the book of Galatians talks about being delivered from the curse of the law, what is the curse of the law? The curse of the law is not that you have to keep it. You know, is it a terrible curse that we're to remember the Sabbath day? Is it a real curse that we can't go out and murder and steal and commit adultery and lie and bow down to idols? This is a real curse? Oh no. The curse of the law is not obedience. The curse of the law is the penalty, the consequence the law places on you when you break it. Because what is sin? 1 John 3:4. Sin is the transgression of the law. Alright? What is the wages of sin? Death. You know, the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So sin is the transgression of the law. We've all sinned, and the wages of sin is death. Death is the curse of the law. Death. That's the curse of the law. Christ came to redeem us from the curse of the law. He came to redeem us from death. The ceremonial law pointed and instructed about access to God. You see, access to God is something that is very holy and that is very precious. The people of ancient Israel treated access to God very cheaply and very casually. God had spoken to them from Mount Sinai. God had hovered over the top with a cloud. He had led them by a pillar of fire at night and a cloud by day. God's presence had hovered over them, and God's presence had overshadowed the mountain, and the mountain quaked, and the fire shot out from the cloud that totally covered the top of Mount Sinai, and the voice of God boomed out. And the people had the opportunity of entering into a very special relationship with God. And the people treated that access, they treated that contact very cheaply, very casually. Here was Moses, the leader of the people, who actually went up into the mountain and he talked with God face to face as a man talks with his friend. That's what it says. Which sort of leads you to believe God had a face, right? Moses dealt with God in a very personal way. God dealt with Moses in a personal way. The people had an access they treated cheaply, they treated casually. Moses comes down the mountain and here they are worshiping the golden calf and dancing around without any clothes on. So Moses said, if you want access to God, you need to realize that is a very precious thing. How do we gain access to God? We're going to see that Jesus Christ fulfilled these things because that's what pointed to Him. People talk about the law pointing to Christ. Well, the ceremonial law pointed to Christ. The sacrifices described what He did. That's why when Jesus died, there was a great earthquake that shook the whole place. You remember? And the veil of the temple rent in two. Showing that now there was access to the Father. There was access to God in a way that had not been readily available. But the people had treated access to God casually and cheaply. And access to God does not come casually and cheaply. It took the life of Jesus Christ to make possible our gaining access to God, because God does not dwell in the midst of uncleanness. That's part of the whole point of the ceremonial law. You see all the washings, the ritualistic washings, were to emphasize to the people that God, the holy God, does not dwell in the midst of uncleanness. And you see, the tabernacle was in the midst of the people. And God said, build a tabernacle and place my ark there in that tabernacle. And I will dwell among the children of Israel. But God will not dwell in the midst of uncleanness. Now, the Old Testament is the story of a people whom God dwelt among. The New Testament is the story of a people of whom it is said that God dwells in us. That we are the temple of the living God. Our bodies are the temple of God's Holy Spirit. So, God was teaching them about holiness. He was teaching the people through the ceremonial law that God does not dwell in the midst of uncleanness, that God is holy, and what comes into the presence of God must be holy. And so we find that when God prepared to set apart Aaron as a priest, in Exodus chapter 28, verse 1, you shall take Aaron your brother and his sons with him from among the children of Israel, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office, even Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar, Aaron's sons. And you shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother, for glory and for beauty. Now these were called holy garments because they were garments that Aaron only wore in the presence of God. Ultimately, what must we wear to come into the presence of God? You read it back in the end of Revelation. We're told that we must put on the garments of righteousness, right? We must be clothed in righteousness. That's why it says in, Revelation 3 that the Laodiceans took theirs off. You know, the Laodiceans are pictured as poor and blind and naked in Revelation 3. We can't come into God's presence that way. You've got to come into God's presence clothed in righteousness. It's sort of interesting. You go through some of the parables that Christ gave. He talked about one who didn't bring a wedding garment at all. One who showed up and didn't put on a wedding garment. He had listened to the old Protestant hymn, Just As I Am. And he thought he could come just as he was. He didn't need to change garments. And you remember the parable. Christ said, friend, how is it you showed up here without a wedding garment? He's cast out into outer darkness. You've got to change clothes. We can't come just as we are. And then you read of some who defiled their garments. They had changed, but they went and got them dirty again. And then you read of the Laodiceans who took their garments off. Some didn't change, some changed, but then went and got them dirty, and some just took theirs off. And neither of those three categories are the ones we want to be in. We want to be in the ones that show up with the clean linen, pure and white. So we've got to exchange our filthy rags for the righteousness of God. We've got to keep it clean by keeping it washed and scrubbed through the water and the Word. And we've got to keep it on. We've got to keep our garments on. And we've got to keep them clean. So that's a different subject, but we find that God instructed Moses here about making garments for Aaron. These were holy garments for glory and for beauty, because he was going to come into the presence of God. He was going to come into the holy place and into the holy of holies. And so that tells us that in the presence of God is glory and beauty. And as Aaron was going to come into the presence of God, he was equipped for glory and for beauty. And it describes, verse 4, the various garments, the breastplate, the ephod, the robe, the broidered coat, the mitre, the girdle, all of these garments. And he was to take gold and blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen You're to make the ephod of gold and of blue and of purple and of scarlet and fine twined linen. And it describes all of these beautiful garments. And the two onyx stones, verse 9, that are to have the names of the children of Israel engraved upon them. And this is to be brought and set. And there was a very specific way that Aaron was to be presented before God. He came before God bearing the names of the children of Israel, bearing the very name representing the people. And we find, of course, that each aspect of his garments, you can compare, of course, to the armor of God, the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the girdle of our loins, girding up our loins with truth, and all of this. And you find that Aaron wore various of these things, and very specific colors that God instructed. It's interesting, again, this is just an aside, but the Jews are very diligently preparing for the restoration of these things. There are schools that were set up in Jerusalem in the aftermath of the reconquest of Jerusalem in 1967 that have, for now approaching 30 years, 25 years, that have devoted themselves to the study of these things and studying in detail of garments being woven that are already being produced. One of the obstacles they ran into was the blue. You find that the blue thread that was used quite a bit in certain things. And they knew from the instructions that had been preserved in the Talmud and other sources that this blue was a particular shade of blue that was derived from a particular snail that had been available on the Mediterranean coast, and a blue dye was derived from this. And they didn't know exactly what the shade of blue was because, none of it was there. They didn't have any in thought. And they didn't know where to get the snails. They knew that anciently that they had gotten them there in the coast of the Mediterranean. It's very interesting because it was just a few years ago that all of a sudden the Mediterranean coast was just covered with these snails. And what they later found is that this particular snail has a very remarkable cycle, and they appear on the Mediterranean coast every 70 years, and they have for as far back as they know. It's interesting that the time for them to appear was just a few years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was 1991, if I remember correctly. Which ought to tell us something. I mean, they could have figured it out and had to wait another 50 years for the snails to come, which would have delayed being able to produce this. But this was the case. I mean, they have done remarkable things. So don't think that there are institutes that are set up there that have studied these things meticulously. They even made arrangements through the Israeli government with a farmer, a rancher in Mississippi. They've imported red Angus cattle. Actually imported red Angus cows that had been bred. You see, the red heifers that were used for purification and were the basis of the sacrificial system, they had to be without blemish, right? All instructions. Well, any animal that was imported from the United States had inoculation marks and were tattooed and couldn't use anything like that. So what they did was the cattle were bred in the United States, and then they transported the cattle over to Israel, and they gave birth in Israel. And the calves, the heifers, were separated out, and they were raised up so that they would be without blemish, and that they were able to start to sort of restart their herds there, realizing that they don't know when. There's not some, but they're doing all that they know to do to be prepared for something that will be the catalyst that will start all of this. And they know one of the things they got to do is they've got to have cattle. Once you start the sacrifices, you've got to sustain them. You need a morning and an evening sacrifice. You've got to have a sufficient herd of cattle that are built up, that meet the specifications, the scriptural specifications, and you've got to have a sufficient number that are without blemish. So you can't just start out with, a few cows and sort of scrounge one up out there. There's got to be, they have to make preparation. It's remarkable, some of the things that they have done. This Institute of Temple Mount Faithful, it's called, one of the groups that's there. They're the ones that almost set off a riot 2 or 3 years ago at the feast when they tried to lay a cornerstone, and the Arabs erupted in riots, and they had to bring in the Israeli army and everything to separate. But they are there, and there are classes, and there are those who are spending their time learning every detail of all of these things. It is a remarkable matter, and I think we're going to see some things over the course of the next, perhaps even few years, maybe even 1 or 2 or 3 years in terms of there in the Middle East. I don't mean everything's going to wind up in that length of time, but I think that we may very well see some things. It seems like much of the preparation for the temple and for the resumption of sacrifices is not that far away. What will occur as the catalyst, we'll have to see. Something will have to do that and to make it possible. The other thing is that they are absolutely convinced. They have run studies, and they are absolutely convinced that the location of the temple and of the Holy of Holies is not where the Dome of the Rock is. That the Dome of the Rock, interesting, this is interesting. This article in the Biblical Archaeology Review on it. All the Israeli archaeologists are now agreed, because they've done some underground work and they located the corner spots. You know where the Dome of the Rock is? It's in what was at one time the court of the Gentiles. That's what it occupies. It occupies the part of the temple. They call it the Temple Mount, and it is the Temple Mount. But where the specific location of it is the court of the Gentiles, which is an interesting thing, because you remember back in Revelation, and how did I get off on this in the middle of Bible study and ceremonial law? In Revelation 11, verse 1, where they were to measure the temple of God and the altar. Verse 2, but the court that is without the temple, leave out and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles. That's sort of interesting. Now, is that exactly what that means? Well, I'm not 100% sure, and I'm not convinced that it doesn't have spiritual implications for God's people and the spiritual temple. It seems like the Gentiles have been doing some treading down there too, but there also seems to be very possibly a description of literally, physically what exists in Jerusalem right now. So, some very interesting things. Well, all this was given. These details. You see, God gave the instructions here in Exodus 28. We'll see also back in Exodus 39. God gave details because God wants to be worshipped in a very specific way. We cannot take a casual, careless approach to God. You remember, Nadab and Abihu did, and they were struck dead. That's recorded for us in Leviticus. Making the point that access to God is precious. It's to be treated as a very precious thing. And we, of course, should certainly realize that access to God was only made possible through the death of Jesus Christ, which shows that it is no simple thing to gain access into the presence of God. That is not something that we should ever treat casually. God impressed that. The ceremony was a schoolmaster for Israel. The realization that coming into the presence of God was not to be treated casually. Access into the very presence of the Creator of the universe. So many times it can be almost treated as a light thing or as just no big deal. When you realize that we've got access right into the presence of God. So all of this is described here in the breastplate of judgment that was made, and all of the details of Aaron's garments that were put here. In verse 30, it talks about put in the breastplate of judgment, the Urim and the Thummim, that shall be upon Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord. He is to bear the judgment of the children of Israel upon his heart before the Lord continually. Now, the Urim and the Thummim involve something that involved stones and a way that God revealed His will in judgment. The way that God actually revealed His will. And that's why gambling and some of this trivializes, because it goes back. You see, the casting of lots, an appeal to God to make a decision. This was something that only the high priest was empowered to do. He bore the Urim and the Thummim upon his heart in this breastplate over the area of his heart. He went in before God, and on very special occasions when a decision, when God's will needed to be revealed, the high priest could call upon God to reveal His will through the Urim and the Thummim. Yes, it does. Gambling perverts that sort of thing, because it trivializes that here you're just going to cast lots or the roulette wheel or dice or whatever. God's not involved in that sort of thing. God is not. You see people, and they'll blow on it for good luck, or they, come on, don't fail me now, and here they are, in effect, calling on something to bless them with a specific response. Well, God's not involved in something like that. And that takes what God was involved in and trivializes it. Now, goes through and it describes the setting apart of the high priest here in as to how they were to do it, and what they were to offer upon the altar. And in verse 45, well, let's notice in Exodus 29:29, the holy garments of Aaron shall be his sons after him, to be anointed therein and to be consecrated therein. And that son that is priest in his stead shall put them on 7 days when he comes into the tabernacle of the congregation to minister in the holy place. So we're told in verse 45, I will dwell among the children of Israel and will be their God, and they shall know that I am the eternal their God, that brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, that I may dwell among them. I am the eternal your God. So we come on back here in the book of Exodus, and let's notice on back in chapter 39. The blue and the purple and the scarlet, they made cloths of service, to do service to the holy places, to make the holy garments for Aaron as the Lord commanded Moses. They made the ephod of blue and of gold and blue and purple and scarlet and fine twined linen. They beat the gold into thin plates and cut it into wires to work it in the blue and in the purple and in the scarlet and in the fine linen with cunning work. Can you imagine what was involved in doing that, and taking gold and beating out just as fine as they could do it, and cutting it and making thin little wires of gold. Little like gold threads that were woven in every so often into the garments. This was something that was very, very, very special. It was for glory and for beauty to come into the presence of God. Now, of course, gold is symbolic of that which is precious. We find Paul compares character that is made of gold tried in the fire. You see, so what is described is coming into the presence of God. You see the purple of royalty, symbolizing the imperial majesty of God. The white that is purity, and the gold that represents a pure character. The attributes we'll find that blue is used to represent truth. The scarlet representing the blood of Christ that paid for our sins. And so we find all of these things woven together in a certain way. That you've got to have righteousness, white. You've got to have purified character. You've got to have truth. You've got to have the blood of Jesus Christ. And so you've got all of these things that are put together in this way. So we find all of these things done. They made in verse 22 the robe of the ephod of woven work, all of blue, and there was a hole in the midst of the robe. As the hole here, it had a band around about the hole, so it wouldn't rend. And they made upon the hems of the robe pomegranates of blue and purple and scarlet and twined linen, and they made bells of pure gold. And they put the bells between the pomegranates upon the hem of the robe, round about between the pomegranates. And so they made this. They made the coats of fine linen, verse 27, and the mitre, and verse 28, the mitre of fine linen, the goodly bonnets of fine linen, the linen breeches of fine twined linen. You might wonder what he wore under the robe. He wore linen breeches. That's what it says right here. Girdle of fine twined linen, blue and purple and scarlet. And they made the plate, verse 30, of the holy crown of pure gold, and wrote upon it writing like the engravings of a signet, holiness to the eternal. And they fastened it here high on this cap that Aaron wore. And he went in. Actually, it describes even these bells that he had here on the bottom of his robe, that as he entered the presence of God. It was sort of interesting. Jews had all sorts of, they would read some of this, and they developed various ideas, and they got worried. This was at a much later time. They became worried as to what would they do if something happened to the high priest while he was in there, because nobody could go into the Holy of Holies except the high priest. And so later on, they developed this to where he had, they tied a cord to it. When he went in there was a cord that he had attached to his foot that was back in, that he went in there, and if the bells quit tinkling for a certain length of time, to where they finally decided something had happened to him, they had a way of pulling him out, you see, that they didn't have to go in there because they were afraid to go into the Holy of Holies. So it's interesting, all sorts of customs, a lot of things that they've come up with that were not specifically spelled out in the Bible. If the high priest was doing what he was supposed to do, he didn't have to worry about something happening to him while he was in the Holy of Holies. But that would be the one place that if you were doing what you were supposed to do, you wouldn't have to worry about anything. And if you weren't doing what you were supposed to do, all the cords in the world wouldn't do you any good, wouldn't get you out of there fast enough. So, all of this was prepared, and they made the articles of worship of the tabernacle. It describes we'll notice the account in Exodus 26 and 27. They made, chapter 26, verse 1, they made the tabernacle with 10 curtains, fine twine, linen and blue and purple and scarlet, with cherubim, of cunning work shall you make them. And so all these curtains were made. We find that, on down in verse 33 of Exodus 26, it talks about, the veil that was to be hung up to divide between the holy place and the most holy. And, the mercy seat was put upon the ark of the testimony in the most holy place. And it describes a table is going to be set up without the veil, and it has a candlestick over against the table. And describes all of these various things. It describes the making of the altar in chapter 27. And it describes the pans to receive the ashes down in verse 3. And the fire pans. And it talks about the grate, verse 4, this grate of brass. Because the altar of burnt sacrifice was in a lot of ways like a giant barbecue pit. That's really what it was. You had a big grate up there, and the meat was burned or roasted or fire roasted there on top. So you had all of this described, all of these details that were there. In the holy place, you see on the outside of the Holy of Holies, or outside of the tabernacle, the courtyard, you had the altar of sacrifice. And you had what was called the brazen laver, which was a great big container that held water. And before someone could enter into the tabernacle, before the priest could enter, sacrifice had to be made on the altar, and they had to wash there with the water. So you had the diverse washings. You see, that was just some of it. There were all sorts of ceremonial washings that were involved. There were holy garments to be worn into the presence of God. Once you came into the tabernacle in the holy place, there were three main articles of furniture. There was the holy place, like you take this as a big room, and let's say that here in the midsection is the curtain that divided the Holy of Holies from the holy place. Actually, it was more of a 2/3, 1/3 was the dimension. But in this portion, in the holy place, there would, right there in front of the post, there would be sitting the altar of incense. And then on one side of the room would be a table that consisted of 12 unleavened loaves that were changed every Sabbath. That was the bread of presence, the showbread, that represented Israel, God's harvest, baked into loaves presented there before God. Then there was also the 7-branched candlestick, or the 7-branched lampstand that contained the olive oil that burned continually and gave light in the holy place. So you had representing the continuity of the congregation of Israel, the one lampstand with 7 branches. Just as in the New Testament, Christ depicted the church as consisted of 7 separate lampstands. In Revelation 1, in the Old Testament church, it was one lampstand with 7 branches. You've often seen the picture. It's often used to represent something connected with the Jews. So the lampstand, the table of showbread, the altar of incense, and then the heavy veil curtain that separated off the Holy of Holies. And inside the Holy of Holies, there was only the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark that was made of shittim wood and covered with gold, and had the mercy seat on top that symbolized the very throne of God, made of gold, and the cherubim that were carved there on each end of the lid, whose wings covered the mercy seat, representative and descriptive of the very throne of God. Now, when you go back to the book of Hebrews, you find that heavenly things were the model for the things in the tabernacle and in the temple. Which tells us, of course, there are things that have form and shape in heaven. They were the model of what was made of gold on the earth. And then under the altar, under the mercy seat, inside the ark was what? The 2 tables of stone, where God had written the 10 Commandments. Which ought to tell us that law and grace go together. Because what was this called? It was called the mercy seat. And it was called the Ark of the Covenant. It contained the covenant. The difference between the Old and the New Covenant, under the Old Covenant, the law of God was written with the finger of God in tables of stone. Under the New Covenant, the law of God, same law, is written in our hearts and in our minds by the Spirit of God. Now, does that sound like the law has gone away? It's inscribed in our hearts and in our minds. So here this was under the mercy seat. And also, there beside the ark, and containers right there on that was the pot that contained the manna that was a witness of God having fed His people and provided for them. Laid up there beside it was Aaron's rod that budded. You remember when somebody got to arguing about why did Aaron get to be the priest? God told them all, bring a rod. Each prince of the tribe brought his rod and set and laid them there in the holy place. They came back in the next morning. They found out that Aaron sprouted branches and leaves and blossomed out and was producing almonds. which, you take an old walking stick and come in one morning and find out the thing is sprouted out, it's got leaves and blossoms and bearing fruit. That'd be quite remarkable. Well, it sort of settled the argument as to whether or not Aaron really was supposed to be the priest or not. And so that was laid up there there by the ark. So you had the pot containing the manna, you had Aaron's rod that budded, and you had the book of the law. The scrolls that contained the scriptures, which were laid up there right beside the Ark of the Covenant. Right there in the side of the Ark of the Covenant. So that was of course, symbolic. It represented the throne of God, the Holy of Holies. Well, what does God represent as being at His throne? Represents the fact that God's law plays a very important part there at the throne of God. The mercy seat, which is on the Ark of the Covenant. That ought to tell us that you cannot separate the law of God from the covenant and from God's mercy. Now, when we look back in the book of Hebrews, we will notice in chapter 8, verse 1, Now, of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum, we have such a high priest, who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. Every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, wherefore it is of necessity that this man have somewhat also to offer. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, seeing there are priests that offer gifts according to the law, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things. As Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle, for see, says he, that you make all things according to the pattern showed you in the mount. Moses was showed a pattern in the mount. It was patterned, it was an example and a shadow of heavenly things. You see, what existed in the law as the ceremonial law, what existed in the tabernacle, all of the articles of furniture and all these things, they were a pattern and a shadow of heavenly things. These things exist in the spirit realm. Moses saw a vision of God's throne. He saw a vision of the presence of God and was instructed that he was to follow the instructions specifically. Make all things according to the pattern showed to you in the mount. Because these things had symbolic value. Now, Christ is our high priest. And He's not ministering in a tabernacle pitched with hands. He's ministering in the true tabernacle in heaven, at the throne of the Father on high. You see, Hebrews 8 comes on down in verse 10 to tell us, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them in their hearts, and I'll be to them a God, and they'll be to me a people. The new covenant is not about doing away with the law. It's about inscribing the law in our hearts and in our minds. Now, chapter 9, verse 1, truly the first covenant had also ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. There was a tabernacle, and there in it was a candlestick and a table of showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And after the second veil, the tabernacle is called the holiest of all. It had the golden censer, the Ark of the Covenant, overlaid round about with gold, wherein was the golden pot that had manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant, and over it the cherubim of glory, shadowing the mercy seat, of which we cannot now speak particularly. And when these things were thus ordained, the priest went always into the first tabernacle, accomplishing the service of God. Into the second went the high priest alone, once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. The Holy Spirit, this signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was yet standing, which was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience. They stood only in the meat offerings, the drink offerings, the various washings, the physical rituals imposed on them until the time of Reformation, Christ being come a high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, he entered in once into the holy place, and having obtained eternal redemption for us. So we find that the ceremonial law, as it says in Hebrews 10:3, in those sacrifices there is a remembrance again made of sins every year, for it's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sin. And coming on down in verse 12, this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God, from henceforth expecting till his enemies be made his footstool. For by one offering he has perfected forever them that are sanctified, whereof the Holy Spirit also is witness to us, for after that he had said before, this is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds will I write them. Their sins and iniquities will I remember no more. Where remission of these is, there is no more offering for sin. So, we have access to the Father through Christ, made possible through His sacrifice. The ceremonial law points to access to God. Now, when Paul talks about the works of the law in Galatians, he's talking about the ceremonial law. He's not talking about the Sabbath. He's not talking about the holy days. He's not talking about the Ten Commandments. He's not even talking about the physical laws or the civil statutes. He's talking about ceremonial laws that were the basis of access to God. And Paul says, if you are depending on those things to give you access to God, then what you're saying is that Christ's sacrifice was unnecessary. You could gain access on your own by carrying out certain rituals. And he says that, and this is the whole point, the ceremonial law was not what really gives you access to God. It was what demonstrated what is necessary to gain access to God, and it points to what Christ would do. You see, there's a vast difference. And there was confusion on the subject or on the role of the ceremonial law. Now let's go on to Leviticus, and let's notice briefly in the time remaining about the sacrificial system. Leviticus chapter 1. Speak unto the children of Israel, this is Leviticus 1:2. Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, if any man of you bring an offering unto the Lord, you shall bring your offering of the cattle, even of the herd and of the flock. If his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will. Or, as the Jewish translation renders it, he shall offer it that he may be accepted at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. He's to put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it'll be accepted for him to make atonement. It's to be killed there before there at that point. It is to be flayed and cut into pieces. And verse 10, the sons of Aaron shall put fire upon the altar, lay wood in order upon the fire, and they shall lay the parts, the head, the fat in order upon the wood. The inwards, the legs are to be washed in water and are to be burned on the altar, to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. And if it's made if the offering is from the flocks, sheep or goats, again, it's to be a male without blemish. And it is to be cut in pieces and placed there. And if it's of the fowl, verse 14, it's to be a turtle dove or a young pigeon. And you shall bring it to the altar, wring off the head, burn it on the altar. The blood thereof shall be wrung out at the side of the altar. And pluck away his feathers with his crop, and cast it beside the altar on the east part by the place of the ashes. Cleave it with the two wings thereof, not divided asunder. The priest shall burn it upon the altar. It's a burnt sacrifice. The first sacrifice that is described as a burnt sacrifice, that is that the victim was offered in entirety. It was presented entirely before God to be consumed on the altar. It was offered without blemish, and it was a voluntary offering, and it was an offering of access. You see, the first aspect of the burnt offerings, the first type of sacrifice. We're going to see there are five types of sacrifices that are enumerated here in Leviticus. This had to do with access to God. Here was something that was, this offering was a type of Christ. Christ was the one who made the sacrifice. He did it of his own will and volition. He was the sacrificial animal. Christ, was the one who was sacrificed, and he was the priest that officiated. And Jesus Christ was offered without spot. He was offered without blemish. He offered himself voluntarily that we might have access to God. And so you see, the starting point in the sacrificial system was for people to recognize that they did not have automatic access to God. Their sins cut them off from God. And without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. And so here was a voluntary offering, a burnt offering that was presented to God. It all went to God, and it was a recognition of their need for a Savior. Now, the second type of sacrifice is mentioned here in Leviticus 2. It is a meal offering. Ironically, it's translated meat offering in the King James, and it is the only offering that doesn't contain meat, as we think of it. Meat is used here in the King James translation in the older English sense of food. It was a food offering. It did not consist of flesh, but rather it consisted of grain, a grain that had been ground into fine flour. This is what it says if we read it here. It's to offer a meal offering, a food offering. It's to be a fine flour. It's to pour oil upon it and put frankincense thereon. It's to bring it to Aaron's sons, the priest. He's to take out his handful of the flour and of the oil and of the frankincense. The priest shall burn the memorial of it upon the altar, and the remnant is to be theirs. Now, the priests get to eat of this. And here is, the individual takes a portion of this fine flour and of the oil, and he brings it in, and the priests take, and they make a cake of it, and they put it on the altar, and it's burned, and the rest of it they take, and they have the utilization of it. Now notice here, it is an unleavened offering. It is to be made in verse 7. There are several ways of making it. It could be baked. It could be fried, verse 7. It'd be a meal offering, baked in a frying pan, made of fine flour with oil. And it's to be taken there and utilized. It's not ever to have leaven, verse 11, or to use leaven or honey, because honey ferments, you put honey in something like that, and it would you leave it stored that way, and of course it would that would create a fermentation type process over a period of time. So an unleavened offering must be presented to God. Here we are, as a part of God's harvest, but we must present. This is to be presented as an unleavened offering. Verse 13, it's to be seasoned with salt. Neither shall you allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your meal offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. So, here was a little bit of salt. We're to be the salt of the earth. If the salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? So here was flour and oil, a little bit of salt, the frankincense for sweet savor. And this was presented here. Again, as an offering to God, symbolic of representing the harvest. And of course, Israel was first fruits unto the eternal, and we are a kind of first fruits of all His creatures. So here was again a voluntary offering. It was a first fruits offering. It was something that was presented before God. Something in which the priests partook. Part of it was burned on the altar to God. Part of it was eaten by the priests, and part of it, and so that's why we put the frankincense in it, because if you burned it on the altar to God, you know what something tastes, what something smells like when it's being burned. that way. So the frankincense was put there to mask the smell and to provide a sweet savor as part of it burned there on the altar. And then the priest took the oil and the flour and a little bit of salt, and they then utilized that for their meals. And the individual had, of course, the quantity that was sanctified by having given a portion of it as a sacrifice. You see, he sanctified the rest of what he had by having given an offering to God. It was set apart. Now, chapter 3 of Leviticus deals with a peace offering. It's to be made of the herd. It can be male or female. It's to be offered without blemish. Again, it is a voluntary offering. And it is an offering of thanksgiving. It is a peace offering. Here, a portion of we find in verse 3 is to offer the sacrifice of the peace offering, an offering made by fire unto the eternal. The fat covers the inwards, and all the fat that is upon the inwards. The two kidneys and the fat that's on them, which is by the flanks, the caul above the liver and the kidneys, it shall be taken away. And Aaron's son shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is upon the wood that is on the fire. It's an offering made by fire of sweet savor unto the Lord. And if his offering for sacrifice, a peace offering, if the flock is to be male or female, offered there. So what was burned on the altar was the fat, was some of the inward parts, and was the fat. The two kidneys, we're told in verse 10, the fat that's on them, which is by the flanks, and the caul above the liver, with the kidneys, it's taken away and burned upon the altar. It is the food of the offering made by fire unto the eternal. Now you can imagine, you start piling some of this up on the altar, and you know what you've got. Any of us who've ever barbecued, you put the meat up there, and when some of the fat gets hot and begins to liquefy and it drips down, the fire goes up. Well, here's a whole mound. As peace offerings are brought in, you've got this whole mound of fat piled up there on the altar. Well, it doesn't take very long. The bottom of that gets hot, and it begins to drip down, and pretty soon you've got flames that are coming up, and you've got this great pyre of fire that just reaches way up as this mound of fat begins to get hot and to burn, just sending this intense heat and big flames shooting way up into the heavens that was there on the altar. The priests then, we find that there was a portion of this that was set aside for the priest, and a portion then for the altar. The offerer took part and the priest took part. Now, we find in chapter 4 that is the sin offerings. The sin offering, and then we'll find chapters 4 and 5 deal with the sin offering. Chapter 6 deals with the trespass offering. Now, the first 3 offerings were voluntary. The burnt offering, the meal offering, and the peace offering were something that the offerer took voluntary initiative to offer, recognizing his need to gain access to God, desiring to express thanksgiving and appreciation to God, to enter into a relationship with God. Paul described that as, he said that's why we shouldn't partake of the table of things that had been offered in idolatrous sacrifice, because the things the Gentiles sacrificed, they sacrificed to demons. Remember, Paul explained that back in Corinthians? And he says that Israel of old, those who offered sacrifices were partakers of the altar. They shared. Part of it was burned to God, part of it was eaten by the priest, and part of it was eaten by the offerer. It was symbolic of entering into a close relationship with God, into fellowship with God. Now when we get to chapter 4, we deal with an offering that's not voluntary, a sacrifice that's not voluntary. Here in chapter 4, the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a soul shall sin through ignorance against any of the commandments of the Lord, any of the things that he shouldn't have done or should have done, then we find that this sacrifice is to be offered. If it's a priest that did it, specific things, if it's a ruler that did it, a bullock was offered by the priest, verse 12. The priest, that was the most expensive thing. You take a bull out and sacrifice him, that's expensive. So God held the priesthood. They weren't supposed to be out transgressing the commandments, and it cost them a bull. That gets expensive in a hurry. The ruler, God charged him a goat down here in verse 23. Goats symbol of stubbornness. And I think maybe that's why God picked that out for the rulers, because they were all of them pretty stubborn. The common people, down in verse 27, that if any of the common people sin through ignorance, which he does something against any of the commandments concerning the things that he ought to have done or ought not to have done, or if his sin, which he has sinned, come to his knowledge, he will bring his offering a kid of the goats, a female without blemish. The ruler had to bring a billy goat. He brought a ram, or a kid of the goats, a male, say, verse 23. He brought a billy goat. That's pretty stubborn. The common people got by with a kid, a female kid that was offered. They laid hands on it, and it was sacrificed, and the blood was put upon the horns of the altar, and the fat was taken and burned, and the priest made an atonement. And so if it was a lamb, it was a female that was offered without blemish, and it was killed. This is what the common people offered. And the priest took the blood, and it was poured out there at the bottom of the altar, and the fat was burned in the same way that the peace offering was. So here was this. We find chapter 4 dealt with a sin offering. Now, this was done because somebody had done something they had not fully realized or fully understood. It, in that sense, is a sacrifice for what we are. You see, there is a sin offering and there is a trespass offering. Chapters 5 and 6 deal with the trespass offering. Now, even chapter 7 goes on a little further with the trespass offering. Now, the sin offering is for what we are. We are sinners. We do things that we don't even fully recognize and understand. We know we've been off the track. But chapters 5 and 6, the trespass offering refers to specific violations. This is something you did. You shouldn't have done it. So, we find that we have to repent of not only what we have done, specific trespasses, we have to repent of what we are on the inside. A heart that is not given to obedience. See, we need to be forgiven for what we are, and we need to be forgiven for what we've done. Now, chapter 5 begins to spell out all sorts of specific things. If you do this, you bring a trespass offering, verse 6, unto the Lord for his sin which he has sinned. And chapter 6 continues on, verse 1, the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, if a soul sin and commit a trespass against the Lord, and he lies unto his neighbor in that which was delivered to him to keep, or in fellowship, or in a thing taken away by violence. Then, verse 4, he sinned and is guilty. He is to restore that which he took violently away, or which he took deceitfully. And about what he's falsely sworn, verse 5, he adds a fifth part. And then, verse 6, he brings a trespass offering unto the Lord. Now, this tells us something about repentance. We find two things involved in the trespass offering. Before you can offer the trespass offering, you have to have made restitution. If you've stolen something from your neighbor, or you cheated him in some way, and you come to repent of it, not only do you have to get square with God, you got to go get square with the neighbor. You can't steal what he has and then keep it and say, I'll steal his herd of cattle and I'll offer one to God as a sacrifice and then I'll keep the rest. See, that's no repentance in that. I go down and rob the bank and think, well, I'll take off, and if I, send a tithe in, well, I guess I can keep the rest. Tell God I'm sorry. Well, no. If I'm really sorry, I'm going to give it back. And this was the principle that if they had committed a trespass, if they had stolen, if they had cheated, if they had done something, they had to make restitution. And they had to offer a trespass offering to God. Now, it doesn't take too long as you start going through Leviticus to realize sin gets expensive. A fella could go through a lot of bulls and goats in a hurry, unless he was trying to be on pretty good behavior. Which, of course, ought to teach us a lesson. See, that's why Paul says it was a schoolmaster. I don't imagine it took most of them too long to figure out that some of this stuff got expensive. But sin is expensive. It cost the life of Jesus Christ. See, sin is not casual. It's not careless. It's not cheap. The penalty for sin is not cheap. So here we find the details in Leviticus 6 of making restitution and coming and asking for forgiveness, bringing the trespass offering. Verse 6, he's to bring his trespass offering unto the Lord, a ram without blemish out of the flock, with your estimation for a trespass offering unto the priest. The priest shall make an atonement for him, and it'll be forgiven him for anything he's done in trespassing therein. So, we find the details and that are given, and then more specific instructions about the type of offering and the way that some of these things are to be divided up, and more details in terms of the trespass offering in chapter 7 and the way it's to be killed and consumed. But the point is, the ceremonial law gives us a great deal of insight into our relationship with God. Because the ceremonial law deals with gaining and maintaining a relationship with God. You see, the physical laws regulate our relationship with the environment around. God set in motion physical laws, and even the heavens and the earth all are governed by the ordinances of God. So God set in motion physical laws that regulate our relationship with the earth, with plants, with animals, with the environment, with all of the physical things. God gave to Moses civil statutes that reflect the way a society ought to function, and the way that misbehavior is to be dealt with, and the way that society is regulated. Paul explains, of course, that we no longer apply the death penalty in the New Testament administration. We're not administering a civil nation. Many of the principles of civil statutes certainly apply and can be applied, but as a rule, they are civil statutes. They govern national and community relationships and cannot be fully applied in a society where we are a scattered people. We find that there are ceremonial laws that have to do with access to God and relationship to God. And we see that those are the only part of the law that was given as a schoolmaster. That is what was given as adding to the law. Because the law, in the overall sense that is described when it refers to that, refers to the basic spiritual law of God. And we'll go into that in greater detail next time. But God is law. And the two great commandments of the law are love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. And so the law tells us how to love God and how to love our neighbor. And as we've already seen earlier in this series, ceremonial laws, the physical laws, the civil laws, the spiritual laws are all tied together. And they all are intertwined. But hopefully, in going into the ceremonial law this evening, we have perhaps a little better understanding of why God gave them and what it is that we are to learn from them. And with that, we'll be concluded this evening.